Well, greeting, lay missioners. I trust you're doing well. I'm going to start a lecture on basically the Great Awakening taking place in England and the United States in the 18th century, 1700s, and focusing on John Wesley, Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, some of the major leaders who were prominent in that, both in Great Britain and in the United States. And then we'll also move toward the formation of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States, which was separate in its rule or autonomy from the Church of England. And so we'll walk through some of that formation, some of that structural change, and some of the key players during that time, and give you a feel for the dynamic of Anglicanism as it's forming in the United States. So with that, let me pause and bring up the notes, and I'll be right back with you. The Great Awakening, generally the dates here run from 1738 to 1784. It was a time of tremendous revival in Great Britain as well as in the United States. And it coincides kind of ironically with the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason being developed and formed, and secularism, and also leads to a lot of deistic impulses, even within the Church of England. And so a lot of these things are very interesting developments, but I want to focus primarily upon the Great Awakening, the religious, revivalistic aspect of things. In 1728, William Law wrote a book, and it's showing basically a tenor of the time, a theme of the time. His book is called A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. And he's very concerned about complacent Christians, presumptuous Christians who rest on their salvation experience and think that God is for them because they're baptized or whatever. And he called upon them to dedicate themselves to devout and virtuous lives. That Christians need to be about God's work. They need to be concerned about their spiritual life and their walk with Christ. And so he gives them a serious call to this devout and holy life. Law himself was a non-juror, and this is a person who had already pledged loyalty to one crown and king, and therefore could not pledge loyalty to William of Orange. And so because of this commitment, he was denied a position as a university professor or parish minister, and two primary ways in which he would have lived his life had that not been his situation. And so he basically preached and conducted his teaching through books. And here's a quote from his work, The Serious Call. If you will here stop and ask yourself why you are not as pious as the primitive Christians were, your own heart will tell you that it is neither through ignorance nor inability, but because you have never thoroughly intended it. In other words, you never really intended to live a holy and devout life. It's just not something you even give thought to. And that's the major difference between you and the early church, was his message. And so Law's influence was very great. Writers like Samuel Johnson, but leaders like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and then ultimately William Wilberforce too. So some very high impact from his writing and his call to holiness. In 1738, you have three individuals who all went to Georgia to serve there for the Anglican Church. Charles was actually the secretary to Governor Oglethorpe. There's a park just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I used to live called Oglethorpe Park, and there's universities and whatever. He was very influential in forming Georgia as a colony, but also as a place where I think prisoners were sent, debtor prisoners. But these individuals all went to Georgia to serve as missionaries. And they were formerly students at Oxford University at Christ Church College. And I went there. I was there a number of years ago. I think it was 2000. I've been there twice, I guess, 2002 and then again in 2009. And when I was there in 2002, I was just so impressed by the great hall where the students eat their meals, these lined up tables perfectly set with table settings. And all around the hall are pictures of kings and rulers and priests and bishops who had studied at Christ Church. And I'm sure Wesley's, and I know Wesley's and Whitfield's pictures are there overlooking the students who sit there now. And so they're sitting with this cloud of witnesses all around them as they're taking their meal in this very serious place of study. Beautiful place, beautiful buildings. And these three individuals, John and Charles Wesley and George Whitfield, were all contemporaries at college at Christ Church. And they belonged to a special group. I think their special name for themselves might have been Methodist because they followed methodologies of spiritual disciplines and focused on the Book of Common Prayer. But they were also called the Holy Club. And whether any of these terms were pejorative or called by themselves, I'm really not sure. But they were very intense about their pursuit of God. Uh, I think Whitfield will consider his conversion to have taken place in his days at Christ Church. John would call his conversion experience to be one much later, even after his time as a missionary in the United States. He went back to England, and on his way back, he was on a ship that was having a lot of difficulty. It was in a storm. And yet there was this family of Moravians who were there, children, parents, women, men, who were singing and praying and at great peace. And Wesley was greatly disturbed that he was not at peace. He said, I traveled across the Atlantic to save the heathen, but who's going to save me? And so it's part of his story, part of his conversion experience. He travels back to Great Britain. He goes to Aldersgate and goes to a Moravian meeting house. And there they were reading, and I say reading, Luther's preface to his commentary on Romans. And he was so overwhelmed by the grace of God. He felt his heart was warmed within him, and he was overwhelmed by God's love. And he became converted. He would term that event to be his conversion. And Charles and others followed him in this experience. And so John became this devoted evangelist, this devoted preacher, and leading and initiating the Great Awakening in Great Britain. He traveled widely. He became one of the most popular men in Great Britain. It's said that he traveled over 8,000 miles on horseback during his career. Charles devoted himself more so to music and writing, although he also would preach, but not as dynamically as Charles. And he wrote over 6,000 hymns for worship and the dynamic worship that attended this evangelical sort of revival in the Anglican Church and in Great Britain itself, spreading even beyond Anglicanism to other denominations. George was the supreme preacher, and he held audiences spellbound by his dramatic sermons, his eloquence, and also his drama, his dramatic flair. Led many people just to be spellbound as he preached in the open air without microphone. John and George, both in this type of a disposition. Uh, George ended up going to the United States several times and also to Scotland. And in England, in the United States, he had a great deal of impact upon the colonies, including the establishment of an orphanage in Georgia. It's understood that he was a friend, in a sense, of Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin, in one of his, I think it's a journal or whatever, I've read this one time, where he was almost fearful for George Whitfield to come because he knew that George would always appeal to him for money. And he had a soft heart for George and all the things George was doing, and therefore felt threatened whenever he came by because, as Ben Franklin is known, he was quite thrifty and not releasing his money too easily. One of the things that's so interesting, I might share this with you sometime, was a series of debates on free grace and divine sovereignty between John Wesley and George Whitfield. It was in sermons, it was in newspaper print, it was in all kinds of public discourse, so that the whole of England knew that they were having a major bout between them. And yet they were individuals who loved each other as brothers in Christ. I remember reading one of the sermons of John Wesley, how he just absolutely condemns the theology of George Whitfield and his Calvinism. He said, you make God himself to be the devil by condemning people to hell and not giving them any opportunity for grace. And yet at the end of it, he says, you know, I sincerely respect my brother, George Whitfield. I know that he'll be closer to God at his judgment seat than I will be, and I will be way in the back, as he will be right beside Jesus Christ in his welcome into heaven. And so there's this great debate between these two, and yet they also have a tenor of cooperation, a tenor of great respect and honor toward each other, kind of rare in public discourse and public disputations in our contemporary world. We date the Great Awakening, First Great Awakening, to around 1740. I guess the dates are sometimes hard to determine and establish. And notice I have links here for some of these articles if you want to read further about them. But open air preaching was very unusual. And for Anglicans, who were mostly opposed to this Great Awakening, you had to be in a sanctuary, in a controlled environment, and they didn't feel comfortable about this open air preaching. They also were not comfortable with charismatic phenomena that was taking place, and also the involvement of the poor and reaching out to the poor, and the connections to Anglicanism and the Church of England was very, very nominal. And this continued all the way to the 1790s. Most Anglicans were rationalistic at this time, even deistic, and they also were connected to Puritan impulses, which were also in the Anglican Church as well, and some of the greater compromises that took place after their major confrontations in the 1600s. And they were very opposed to the emotionalism of the Great Awakening. And so their intellectualism, almost like a snobbery, that prevented their participation in this religious revival movement that was one of the greatest and most impactful of modern post-Reformation history. The liberal opposition to the Great Awakening is called the Old Light, and the rejection of this new light that comes with Wesley. What's interesting is Wesley and Whitefield, Wesley himself and Charles Wesley, John and Charles, remained Anglicans till the day they died, even though their influence and their establishment of these little charter houses, Methodist houses, aside from the church, which were centers where people would go and do Bible study and hold each other accountable and go through disciplines. These were on the side of the church, and eventually there would be a separation between the Methodists and the Anglicans until they died. They were basically within the church, and they didn't leave the church. It was their church. Jonathan Edwards in the United States, he's in Massachusetts. He is a leading figure in the colonies. It's arguable that George Whitefield probably had greater influence on the Great Awakening in the United States than Jonathan Edwards, but they both stand very tall as pillars of the Great Awakening movement. He's always known for his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That's something I read, I think, in high school as a required reading for American literature. But Edwards himself rarely preached on hell, and he majored on the love of Christ, the grace of God, religious affections, how our affections really are determinative of our spirituality and how they need to be converted themselves. He spoke about justification by faith and taught on this as a major theme. And a Calvinist as well as Whitefield, he was also a very zealous evangelist, seeking to establish churches, lead people to Christ, to more serious and devoted lives. And that's a theme which obviously I think I've shared before, that I'm not a strong Calvinist, but when I see Calvinists with a tremendous zeal for evangelism and holiness of life, I find that that's that sort of conditions my sometimes my concerns that I see within Calvinistic impulses. And with Whitefield and Edwards both would exemplify tremendous compassion for the lost and desire to see them become converted. Just as a point of note here, music that's being developed, 1741, George Frederick Handel composes The Messiah, which is obviously a tremendous piece of music that is having a major impact upon spirituality. It's part of the Great Awakening, I think, as far as musical influence. Down a couple of notes below there, 1779, the only hymns were published, and the revivalistic music that was being produced during this time. They're evangelical songs, and they include the first form of Amazing Grace with more stanzas than what we would have in our rendition of it. written by John Newton, who was a converted slave trader, as well as a number of hymns by William Cowper and others who are very influential during this time. These are not exclusively Anglican. They are beyond that. Anglicanism was, again, not deeply invested in the Great Awakening, but these changes in music are going to impact over time in a greater way the Anglican Church. Charles Simeon, 1779, he's a very scrupulous college student, and he discovered the God's free grace in Christ Jesus while preparing to receive communion at Cambridge. It's a kind of interesting story. He was a student at Cambridge, and one of the requirements of the university was that once a year, students are required to receive communion. And Simeon, who was a very serious individual, said, if I'm required to have Eucharist, then I've got to redeem my life, change my life, and become a committed Christian before I can take the Eucharist. And he did so. And that led to his conversion. And he served as chaplain at Cambridge for 55 years and was a leader of Anglican evangelicalism. And I say evangelicalism not in the sense of American evangelicalism, but in the sense of this revivalistic, sort of pietistic, as well as deep concern for conversion and the Word of God and Scripture, all these things are deep themes of what we would call an enduring evangelicalism that began really with the Reformation and moves all the way through to contemporary times. What we call American evangelicalism and its political manifestations is a rather oddity in this long history of this term. So Simeon is a very important individual. The last note I have here on this page is in the United States, one of the concerns of the Anglican Church there was that the Anglican Church of the Church of England would not send bishops or ordain bishops for the United States. And so anytime that someone needed to be ordained as a clergy member, whether it's a priest, a deacon, they had to travel to Great Britain. And in their travel to Great Britain, they had to be ordained by a bishop of the Church of England. And in that ordination service, they also had to pledge their oath of allegiance to the crown of England. And this became more and more problematic, particularly as the church faced the American Revolution, and that becomes a major theme in the United States. And Wesley's group was getting more and more disenfranchised from the Anglican Church, the American portion of the Anglican Church. And in 1784, they formed the Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore by some elders who were ordained by John Wesley. And this was the beginning of Methodism as a separate denomination from Anglicanism. So you date it from 1784, just after the Revolutionary War. And the first bishops were Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. And they are characterized by itinerant preaching, travel from place to place. Methodism and Baptist, those individuals, those two denominations became major forces of evangelism and church planting all throughout the colonies, but also in the movement west. Whereas Anglicanism remained pretty staid in cities and not terribly evangelistic, not terribly progressive, and very conditioned by a more soft culture, I think, in many respects. Methodism was very rapid moving, and Francis Asbury himself traveled thousands of miles on horseback, and they would have these itinerant going from church to church to church that didn't have pastors, and they would preach and do outdoor preaching as well, and continue on some of the forms of the First Great Awakening. This leads us to talk a little bit about how the independent, autonomous Protestant Episcopal Church was formed in the United States. And this is an important consideration. This has continuity both with, I think, ACNA, but also with TEC, the Episcopal Church. Its original name in the United States was the Protestant Episcopal Church, and this distinguished it obviously from the Church of England. 1776 is obviously the Declaration of Independence declared by the American colonies. 2/3 of the signers were nominal members of the Church of England. So they were Anglicans, but they did not want the colonies to be governed by bishops. They felt that the bishops were compromised in the sense that they were controlled by the English government, and therefore they lacked the autonomy that they desired. And many of the Anglicans in the United States fled to Canada or remained as Tories. If they were loyal to the crown, then they struggled to a certain extent, particularly once the Revolutionary Army became more and more successful. The greatest part of this page of notes is talking about how did the Church of England, how did the Protestant Episcopal Church form in the United States? And it's a slow process, partly due to the fact that there was this situation where the Church of England was unwilling to ordain bishops for the United States. And so one of the keys is, how do you get bishops who are able to be people of the United States who aren't required to pledge loyalty to the British Crown? And so here's the beginning of this story. And 1782, you have William White, a very important figure. He's rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia, which is a very important Anglican church in this city. And he wrote The Case of the Episcopal Church the United States Considered. And he's trying to lay out a foundation, and he suggests that clergy and laity elect some bishops and not bother about apostolic succession yet. Apostolic succession was important. It is important in Anglicanism, but they felt like we need bishops so badly that let's choose some bishops and let's deal with the issue of apostolic succession at a later time. And that's him in his initial process here. And so you can hear some agitation. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was really agitating. Even in Holmes' book on the history of the Episcopal Church in the United States, he actually says that the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, because it was sort of agitating for the independence of the American church, they might have had at least a place to play in the movement toward the American Revolution, which is kind of an interesting point. Obviously, there are many other factors involved, but he says that's at least one point of the many. Samuel Seabury is a very important figure in the founding of the Episcopal Church in the United States. He's from Connecticut. He was consecrated the first American bishop by bishops of the Episcopal Church of Scotland. And so November 14th, 1784 is a very important date in the independence of the American Anglican Church. And his ordination, and he was ordained by the Episcopal Church of Scotland after his ordination was rejected by the English bishops, who were forbidden by law not to consecrate a bishop who did not take the oath of allegiance to the crown. And so Samuel Seabury was not willing to take that oath of allegiance. They refused to ordain him, so he went to the Episcopal Church of Scotland, and the bishops there agreed to ordain him. And so he ends up being the first American bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States, and who was then operating in the United States to ordain clergy from that point. The Scottish Church was independent of the Church of England and Crown, and it was a non-juror church, and not pledging allegiance to the crown, and it required that Seabury adopt the Scottish 1764 Eucharistic service, which was based upon the Eastern Orthodox service. And with minor modification, that is the communion or Eucharistic service that is utilized in our churches today among Episcopals as well as Anglicans. 1785, you have a gathering of a general convention of American Anglicans or Episcopals. The name Episcopal basically derives from the organizational structure of the denomination that were led by bishops. And so to distinguish it from the Church of England, the Anglican Church, it called itself the Episcopal and the Protestant Episcopal Church, unlike the Catholic Episcopal Church or the Orthodox Episcopal bishop-led churches. And so there's this first gathering that's being held. It's unofficial, 1785. It was boycotted by Seabury, who was the only bishop in the United States, Anglican bishop in the United States. And he was also boycotted by the other New Englanders because provisions had not been made for a bishop to preside. And so this was being organized and led by priests and by lay people. The name of Protestant Episcopal Church was chosen, and the production of an American prayer book was authorized. And so they're starting to move forward with organization and structure here. 1786, you have another general convention. It was held. And at that convention, they learned that the Archbishop of Canterbury was now willing to ordain bishops for the United States without that pledge of loyalty and oath of allegiance. And Seabury still was uncooperative, and the proposed American prayer, Book of Common Prayer was approved for use on a state-by-state basis. It wasn't totally official, but it was utilized and excising some of the language of pledging to the and praying for the crown, King George. 1787, William White and Samuel Provost of New York, these two individuals, William White was from Philadelphia, they were consecrated bishops by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So they had traveled to Great Britain and they were consecrated bishops for the United States. And this was largely due to the pressure that the Scottish bishops had placed upon the Church of England. And the Church of England did not want to lose its influence and its continuity with the United States. And so the very idea that the Episcopal Church of Scotland had ordained a bishop was something that really provoked them. And they would, I think, probably consider Samuel Seabury somewhat illegitimate at this time. And they ordained two bishops for the United States, William White in Pennsylvania and Samuel Provost in New York. And White was very industrious. He was largely responsible for writing the Constitution of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the USA. And it basically is that Constitution that constitutes the Episcopal Church today, and also has, I'm sure, a very deep influence upon the ACNA and some of its constitutional organs and writings. 1789, the first general convention of what became the Protestant Episcopal Church in the USA was held in Philadelphia with William White as the presiding bishop. House of Bishops and House of Deputies were established, after which Seabury agreed to join. And so you have some reconciliation going on at this point, beginning in 1789, with its first official general convention of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the USA. The Book of Common Prayer of 1789 was established, and this version was used all the way from 1790, the first year of its use, to 1892. So over 100 years, it stayed in place as the official Book of Common Prayer for the Protestant Church of the United States. The last part of our notes here raises a rather difficult story in the United States at this time, because the Episcopal Church the American Episcopal Church had some grounding in New England and in the middle colonies, but in the South it also had some founding as well. And in that context, there were, and also in the middle colonies as well, including Pennsylvania, some of the story about conflict between whites and blacks arises during this time. In 1794, there was a church that was admitted into the Diocese of Pennsylvania by William White. It was the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. It was the first Black Episcopal church in the United States, independently and exclusively segregated as Black. The church was formed when a group of Black believers at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church was required to sit in the balcony. Even during the prayer, I think some of the opening prayers, they were tapped on the shoulder by ushers and said they couldn't sit in the main floor of the church, but that they were required to go sit in the balcony because they were Black. And so a very negative experience here. They left the church. They formed their own church. It was sort of a non-denominational church, and noticed that this was in a Methodist Episcopal church, which wasn't Protestant Episcopal. It's kind of confusing at this time, but Methodists were sort of moving off in their own bent. there were two leaders. One was Absalom Jones, which I've got him hyperlinked down below, and then Richard Allen. Richard Allen was very committed to remaining in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and he kept his followers affiliated with the Methodist Episcopal Church, but later on, he founded the AME, or African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I think this is in the early 1800s, 1811, I think, when he founded the AME Church. And I was actually the academic dean of interim academic dean for a Payne Theological Seminary, which was an AME seminary, officially approved. And I learned some of this story when I was serving in that capacity, and found it to be a fascinating environment, quite liberalized to this point. The AME Church has become quite liberal with liberation theology perspectives and other ideology as well. But Richard Allen was very committed to maintaining that. Absalom Jones, on the other side of things, developed a relationship with William White, and William White brought in the African Episcopal Church, and he set up Absalom Jones to be an individual who would go through a period of study. He'd become a lay reader, he'd become a deacon, and then be ordained a priest of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. And so Absalom Jones is a very important figure, and he's the first Black Episcopal priest in the United States. So some of this sad story has a lot of development to it. You have the development of the AME Church, but you also have the Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church. They have remained somewhat more conservative than the AME Church, but they're founded about this time. I don't think the AME Church and the Zion AME Church were aware of each other for a period of time, and then they finally discovered there's some parallel developments, and yet they remained separate institutions in the early 1800s as they had their founding. The last individual to mention here about developments in the United States, you have Anglicanism sort of had this nominalist perspective. It was resistant to Wesley and Whitefield. It was resistant to revival impulses, and it did reorganize and restructure itself following the Revolutionary War. But it really comes into a time of major revival under John Henry Hobart. He's a very high church bishop of New York. He has a high church perspective. And he was a person who did not have a lot of physical power in terms of his own stature, in terms of his health, a lot of issues in his life. But he was a tireless servant of God. And his efforts as rector of Trinity Church in New York City, Trinity Church was one of the most wealthy churches in the country at the time, and probably still is. Founded King's College and other institutions with great endowments that they had. But he was tireless as their rector, he was tireless as bishop, and he led to the establishment of very strong dioceses. He developed and he was a bishop who visited all of his churches, even though New York was expansive. Even New Jersey and Connecticut, I believe, came under his leadership because they were without a bishop for a period of time. And he visited all of them, and he knew the clergy, he knew their issues, he knew their concerns. He was just tireless in his efforts for building up the body of Christ and building up the Episcopal Church in this time. He was very devoted to establishing and training up leaders. So he established a Geneva College, which later was renamed Hobart College. And General Theological Seminary was the first Episcopal seminary established in the United States for the training of ministers. And he was tireless in his efforts to see that to become established. And because of that, he was very effective in the multiplication of clergy and churches and parishioners, and the church grew tremendously under his influence. And so you can mark him as a very important figure in the founding of Anglicanism in the United States, and a revivalistic type of Anglicanism that's very tireless in terms of establishing churches and winning people to Jesus Christ, and I think even reaching in this time, and even before this, to some of the Native American populations as well. And so we do have some very bright spots developing in the Anglican Church here. I'm going to stop there. I just want to give you a couple pages of a quick overview of what's taking place. The Great Awakening, First Great Awakening, had tremendous impact upon colleges and universities, and probably had greater impact upon the formation and development of other denominations than Anglicanism itself, which is kind of a sad story because Anglicanism sort of rejected it, but had great impact upon Congregationalists and Methodists, development of Methodism, and then the Anglican Church takes on its story of development when it finally gets established and gets its constitution set and starts having bishops and start organizing and developing the United States. And then when Hobart comes along, revivalistic impulses develop and grow, and it becomes more and more devoted to things of Christ. So I'll stop with that, and I'll let you listen to the lecture, and we'll be in contact again soon. God bless you.